Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Well, we're so excited today to have Connie Zweig back on the podcast. We've had her on a couple times before, and they've always been blockbuster episodes. So welcome again, Connie.
Thank you.
It's super exciting to have you on talking about these particular books, which I'll mention in a minute, because as I think I've said before, I first came across your work when I started at the Philadelphia Jung Seminar in 2000. And we we were assigned one of your books, and it's still sitting right over there on my shelf. It's been a real wonderful guide, and it's a great introduction and a very deep one. There we go to the topic. So Connie Zweig is a retired Jungian therapist and author of Meeting the Shadow, which now has a new edition, and Romancing the Shadow, which also has a new edition. And we're having her on to sort of mark the new editions coming out. Her award-winning book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, extends shadow work into midlife and beyond, and explores aging as a spiritual practice. Her book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, The Dance of Darkness and Light and Our Search for Awakening, extends shadow work into religion and spirituality. Her new podcast, Dr. Neil's Spiritual Awakening to Non-Duality, posts on all podcast platforms. And she also has a Substack where there are live streams and new writing. And the Substack is called shadowworkawareness.com. So, Connie, we are so excited to get to talk to you about this. As you well know, shadow is very up in the collective now, and you are one of the original post-Jungian articulators. So it's thrilling to have you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Deb. Really, really happy to join you today.
Shadow has become such a colloquial term, one of Jung's concepts that has really resonated. And yet I think we tend to sort of land on it briefly and then go, oh, yeah, shadow. Shadow work, definitely. We all have a shadow and keep moving. And your work and your books really get down to the nitty-gritty, granular level of how, where that lives in us, and more to the point, perhaps, what to do about it. There's real methodology here that I think is incredibly useful because it gives people a way to practice.
Thank you, Deb. Yeah, for some reason, I'm not one of those people who said, oh, yeah, shadow, and moved on. I don't know why. It kind of, with my first analysis, it stuck to my bones. And so a lot of my career has been about doing my own shadow work, teaching it to my clients, developing the books that Lisa just mentioned, teaching lots of webinars and courses online. And so I've kind of been carrying this for a long time now. And I think that's one of the reasons I sort of feel internally prepared to see what's happening in the collective. I still feel very disturbed, but I do feel like I have the language and some tools to be able to understand what's going on. And that's really what I wanted to share.
Oh, by all means. I think everyone is hungry for that, so go for it.
So, Meeting the Shadow, which you just held up, now has a new cover and a new epilogue that updates it to the current events. And that book is really an overview. It's a kind of a sweeping landscape of how the shadow appears in all the different arenas of our lives, in relationships, in families, in work, in creativity, and in politics. And then Romancing the Shadow also has a completely new look. And this book focuses on relationships and how we sabotage ourselves in relationships, how the shadow acts out and sabotages our love, our commitment, our communication, our attachment, and so forth. And this book has a new foreword by Kayla Shaheen. Kayla wrote a little journal, a workbook called the Shadow Work Journal, and sold 1 million copies of it on TikTok.
Oh, yes.
And so that started a kind of a renaissance of interest in shadow work in the younger generations. Because those of us who are our age and have been in the Jungian world forever have known about this for decades. But she has reached new generations, and that's why both of the publishers of my earlier books came back to me and said, let's get these out there again.
That's
so
great.
I'm thrilled that younger people, and I've had a lot of them reach out to me and say, CBT has its limits. All these other methods have their limits. And I'm discovering new parts of myself and why I'm doing what I'm doing with shadow work. So I'm really grateful that this is now reaching new generations. In terms of what we're seeing in the collective, I think, when we turn on the news or read online, the shadow is screaming at us from the headlines now, every moment of every day. And what does that mean? Because as Deb said, we use that word as if we know what it means. It's in the vernacular, but we don't necessarily have a psychological understanding of it. And you guys do. So I'm looking forward to this deeper conversation with you than I can usually have. What I see is that because the psyche is kind of built this way, it's built to unconsciously attribute to other people what is unacceptable in ourselves, what we dislike, what is taboo, what is unwelcome, what is even horrific to us. Some part of ourselves, a feeling, a habit, a belief, and it may be very hidden even from us. It may not be conscious, but the psyche defends itself against that by attributing it to another person or group. So that group is lazy, I'm not lazy. Or that group is aggressive, I'm not aggressive. Or that woman is seductive, I'm not seductive, right? Or that man is money hungry, greedy, but I'm not greedy. And all of us are doing this all of the time. And sometimes in very overt ways and sometimes in very subtle ways, even within our own families. A family member can become a target of projection within the family and become the family scapegoat. Within our church and religious communities, other groups can become infidels, right? They're going to hell. They're non-believers. That happens in every faith tradition. Other kinds of communities, like now we're seeing all the conflicts on college campuses between the people who support Israel and the people who support Palestine. And the way they're making enemies of each other as if they have nothing in common.
Right.
And that particular conflict is archaic. It's gone on for centuries, and it's rooted in shadow projection. And there's some beautiful essays in Meeting the Shadow about how this happens in the political arena, how it happened during the Cold War with Russia and the US, perfect mirror enemies of each other. If we start to use this psychological lens, both in our personal lives and in the collective, in the news, we can start to kind of see through the more obvious dynamics that we're struggling with. Maybe in an intimate relationship, could be somebody is making blaming their partner. You're doing that to me. And how can you look at that dynamic as a shadow projection, as a part of yourself that you're asking the other person to carry for you. It doesn't mean your partner isn't innocent or isn't behaving that way. And if the partner's abusive, it may not be a projection.
Well, and there's always a hook for a projection.
And there's always the hook.
So there's some bit of truth that makes the projection stick.
Yes. So it goes both ways. Yes. So if we begin to kind of just use this as framework or a filter on our personal lives and our social lives and our political lives, we can begin to see a little more deeply into what's happening.
Yeah. Jim Hollis, who is a noted Jungian analyst and author, has delivered many a presentation and lecture, and people say, well, all right, fine, I'm willing to deal with my shadow. How do I know what my shadow is? And Jim always says, think of somebody that really rubs you the wrong way, somebody you can't stand or gets under your skin, and then really sort of distill the characteristics of that person that are so aversive. And there's your shadow. And I remember doing that years ago when he came to Philadelphia. I thought, oh, wow. Well, I had no problem identifying some number of people that I just really did not like. I really thought they were off base or wrong or irritating or 100 other things. And I thought, really, all those things, me? It was quite a moment of amazement and shock. And I think the other thing that's in, I think, Romancing the Shadow in the introduction is that Jung says dealing with our shadows is a moral problem. And that is really an interesting way to put it. Are we really going to go there? Are we really going to take a look at all those things and really engage with ourselves to take responsibility, deepen our awareness, hold the paradox?
And not act out that part. I think that's what's the moral ethical issue, is not act out that part of ourselves. And so I would say today shadow work is a social responsibility.
Yeah, and Jung says that, the best, deepest political work that anyone can do is work on withdrawing their shadow projections. I mean, that's a paraphrase, but it's something like that.
And that doesn't mean we can't be politically active. We can do our inner work and we can do our outer work, right? We can do, in fact, I have a whole chapter about this in the Inner Work of Age. We can do our shadow work and reclaim those projections. And then what happens is we have a different motivation for our social justice work.
Mm-hmm.
It feels really different. I remember when I was in college in Berkeley in the late 60s and I was an activist, it was all fueled by anger, right? And early family dynamics and projection onto the establishment. And now my political work feels more like it's fueled by grief. It feels very different. And it's not so much rooted in enemy making, because I feel compassion for these for the people I watch getting hooked into these belief systems, getting entranced, and voting in certain ways and voting against their own self-interest. I feel compassion for them and for the consequences now that they're going to reap, right? But that doesn't mean I should be paralyzed. Just because I want to own those parts, it doesn't mean I don't want to act. So let me take it a little bit further than Jim Hollis, because our method is a little bit more concrete. So we begin to notice what we're projecting onto the other person by what we're saying to ourselves. And you said really clearly, Deb, it sounds like you're auditory because you know what you're saying to yourself, right? You know the repeating sentences in your mind when you're triggered by a shadow. So other people are more kinesthetic. So they may be able to track their bodily reaction and notice what's repeating. Their solar plexus gets queasy, their shoulders tighten, their throats close, right? And other people are feeling types, and they may notice the feelings that come up that are the same every single time. Like what you said, I can't stand that. So I would be saying to myself, I can't stand that. I would recognize, because I'm auditory too. But somebody else would recognize the bodily sensations or the feelings. And then the next step is, who is that? What part of me is having that reaction? And it's the same reaction every single time. Every time there's the same trigger, oh, he is so aggressive, I can't stand that. Then you say the same thing, your body reacts the same, and you feel the same feelings. So who is that? And what you do is you give it a name and you give it an image. So let's say it's, a male aggressor. So you give it an image. Let's say it's a man with a fist. Okay? And it's angry John or whatever. We don't want to name it our parents or partners' names, right? Because we want to kind of free that up. So it's angry John and he's making a fist. Now we have a shadow character that we can identify and start to build a conscious relationship with.
And this was one of Jung's real insights, was that when you can personify unconscious contents, then you're no longer in identification with them, and you can start to have a dialogue and a relationship with that part of yourself.
Exactly. So you can begin to dialogue verbally or with writing or with creativity, active imagination, or you can watch for that figure in your dreams, and you can trace it back in your history. When did I first notice Angry John? In college, in high school, in childhood? And why did that shadow character form? Because every shadow character forms as a defense to protect you against something. And it has valid needs. Like maybe Angry John needs to be heard or needs to be seen as strong. There's a valid need in every shadow character. And if we as adults can begin to meet that need of that part of ourselves, it will begin to recede. It will start to lose its charge. And there's this shift that happens in the psyche. So I remember for me, my very first shadow figure was the judge. I was very judgmental when I was growing up. And as I worked with that and saw that it was protecting, because it was like making me feel superior, it was protecting me from feelings of inferiority, feelings of not enough. And as I began to work with it over a number of years, it receded. I don't experience so much judgmentalness anymore in late life. And that's because that when it's unconscious, it has more charge. And the more conscious relationship we make with it, as Lisa was saying, the less we identify with it, and the more it can take a different place in the psyche. So romancing the shadow is about how to do that in relationships. Yeah. How to break unconscious communication patterns and behavior patterns and really create, conscious, loving, empathic, clear communication habits, because that's what allows us to be intimate and to feel safe, right? And to feel attached.
Can you give us a few examples of that? Because I think there aren't very many people who don't need more of that.
Yeah, we all do. So, one of my clients came to a session crying. She was about 30 years old, and she told me that every night she'd go to the fridge and eat ice cream while she was waiting for her boyfriend to call. And he would never call, or he would rarely call. And she would eat the ice cream and she would go to bed, and she was getting really depressed, and that's why she reached out to me. So the presenting symptom, as we would say in therapy, was overeating. But we began to explore that. And what we discovered was she was afraid of communicating with him directly. Do you want the relationship? Because she was afraid of being rejected and abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
And so she would eat compulsively. And then she realized when we were talking that her mother did the same thing because her father used to come home very, very late and he wouldn't call, and her mother would eat. And she modeled that behavior to her daughter. And the mother, instead of communicating with her husband, just stuffed the feelings. And she learned to stuff them with the food. So that's what my client was doing. It made perfect sense, right? She didn't have another strategy. So it took us a few months of exploring this. And she called the shadow character the foodie. And every time the foodie would come up, she'd have the same thought, he doesn't care about me. And the same feeling, an empty belly, or sensation, an empty belly, and the same feeling of sadness and helplessness. And so she would eat. Some people would drink, some people would smoke weed. Some people would use another substance, right?
Scroll on your phone.
Right. Or have sex with someone else. So we called it the foodie, and she began to track it over the next few months and see that it was basically related to this fear of being rejected. So eventually she called him up and she said, "Do you want to be in a relationship with me?" And he said, "No, I just haven't been able to tell you." So she was devastated. But here's the thing. 2 weeks later, she said, "Oh my God, I'm so glad I know now. I mean, it hurts, but I'm so relieved to know the truth. I don't have to spend my life waiting for him and eating." So she used that situation to do her shadow work, and she learned a lot about herself and about her, her capacity to communicate her needs and to survive the response.
Connie, can I just follow up though? Because I think maybe it would be good to try to sort of nail down a good definition of shadow. Because with that example, I'm kind of thinking, gee, that sounds like a complex. Because I always think of shadow, according to the Jungian formulation, it's really these parts of ourselves that are a little distasteful to us that we just don't want to know about. But it sounds like when she was in this terrible state of dysregulation and distress and feelings of abandonment and loneliness, perhaps that she was, like you were saying, she was eating as a kind of a defense against those feelings. But to me, that feels a little different than shadow. So how does your understanding of shadow differ from this kind of classical Jungian sense of shadow?
My sense is there's shadow material in every complex.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we have a negative mother complex, there are shadow characters in there. It could be a negative body image. It could be a sexual abuse history that has a shadow character in it, right? It could be an anger or a depression or some kind of affect issue that is part of that grouping of feelings and images that we call a complex, but that can be isolated out as a shadow character. And there could be multiple shadow characters in a negative mother complex. Does that make sense? So like in my mother complex, I would say there's a depressive part that's a shadow character. And then there's what I would call a passive shadow character that's different. I mean, my mother really gave up her power to my father. It has a different felt sense than the depression she suffered. So I work with them differently, even though I'm aware that they're part of that complex. Does that make sense?
But I can see that it gives you and gives the person you're working with, and could give us by reading and using your books, a way to get a real handle on something, to isolate it, differentiate it, and make it real. There is this part of the complex. And sometimes people, and there's a whole way of therapy in Sandra Tray that, I'm very supportive of people making or getting some little figurine of something to really concretize it, of, like your example of Angry John. Maybe get a little plastic figurine of the Incredible Hulk or something. And, but again, what we're doing is separating and differentiating more and more and more, rather than it's all in here and it's vague. Now I have this little figurine of, let's say, hypothetically, the Hulk. And it actually helps to have something you can hold and touch, something maybe you write in your journal, something you can talk to.
And Deb, it also adds the archetypal dimension, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the Hulk has this archetypal quality. Angry John feels a little more personal, right? But if it's the Hulk, or whatever name we might give to a masculine, a Zeus figure, then we can add the archetypal dimension to it. And I think that for people who really want to do Jungian work, that's the next level of shadow work. And that's in Romancing the Shadow, there's a lot of the archetypal dimension to each of these characters. And that helps us with our dream work too, right? That leads us right there.
That's such a great point, because this is a way to do it, a way to make it, some of these words that we have about shadow, we think we know what it means, or archetypal is out there in the collective. And what does that mean? It's like, wow, that's like archetypal. Whereas, if you have that figure in that image, that feeling, and it's a shadow element of the aggressor, and you personify it, you may actually get to an archetypal taproot. All these things have a universality, as well as how we personalize it in ourselves.
When I was writing Romancing the Shadow in the 1990s, I was exploring Athena, because I realized at some point in my own analysis that I was really living the story of the virgin goddess Athena, who never married. This was before I met my husband, who never married. She was the goddess of the city, of learning. She came out of her father's head. I mean, it was my story in every detail. And so I got a little statue of the goddess Athena.
Aha.
Yes. I have a collection of some goddess statues on my bookshelf. And that helped me so much. And let me see if I can explain why. Because it lifted my story out of the personal realm into this universal, I want to say heroine's journey. We don't have a good word for it, but into...
well, you understood that your life was part of the great story.
Into the great story.
It wasn't just yours.
That is so freeing, isn't it?
It's very healing.
It's very healing to recognize that. And the thing is, living Athena's life gave me a great career life. But she cannot do relationships. And when I met Neil, she became a shadow figure, because she was the one who kept cutting off the intimacy. She didn't want to be trapped. She wanted her freedom.
Mm-hmm.
She's a virgin goddess. She didn't want to be bonded, right? She wanted just the contribution of work. And every time I would do that, Neil would say, "That's Athena." And I started to recognize that she was becoming a shadow figure. And I had to let her change her position in my psyche if I was going to really have a serious relationship. So that story no longer served my intention. And it took a long time to make that shift out of that story. And, there are very few feminine archetypes that are complex enough for our sophistication today, right? I mean, I wasn't going to become Hera.
Yeah.
Yeah, nobody wants to be Hera.
Yeah, so it was very tricky. In my psyche, it was very tricky. I knew the story was changing, but you can't control that with your ego. It has to unfold. So luckily, I found a guy who understood and who helped me through. Yeah.
So in some sense, the part of you, we might say the part of you that, was ready and open for a relationship was very much in the shadow.
Yes.
And it was something that was a shadow aspect that you that you wanted to and were able to integrate maybe, toward the middle of life.
Yes. And you see, we could say that that was part of my mother complex. That part of me, I remember making a vow when I was very young that I would not become my mother. I think a lot of girls and women have felt that, right? I would not live her life. So that was that inability to bond and to have intimacy was part of that complex, and it was a shadow figure.
And I agree with you that Greek mythology doesn't necessarily give us really great images of the feminine, but there is much more to choose from. There's always Isis, if you want a mythological figure, or plenty of images from India, and plenty of images even just from stories. I remember as a child in the children's library of meeting Madame Curie and Harriet Tubman and a whole host of and there are plenty of sources of inspiration for any of these shadow elements. You have a wide range of choices.
Yes. Well, right now the figure that's by my bed is Saraswati. And she's the Indian goddess of learning and music.
Mm.
Yeah. And her story is very beautiful to me. So you're right. We need to explore lots of other cultures and see what resonates. And then watch and see if it changes over time. Right? Because for one cycle in my life, Athena was a great fit. And then she wasn't anymore. She became a shadow figure, sabotaging my dreams.
I think you're also veering into what is often termed golden shadow or positive shadow, that we can pick images and concretize them in a figurine or a drawing or something like that of something that is important to us, the telos of where does psyche want to go? What's uppermost for us now as here's my intention, here's what resonates with me, here's what calls me.
Yes.
To keep that in mind and to keep the connection then between what's bubbling up from below in the unconscious and lifting it up to consciousness, just in a relatively easy, small way of like, oh, I see that every morning and I see that every evening. And yes, I want to keep that bigger purpose of my life just in mind.
In my awareness. And an image can do that. Yes.
The thing about shadow is that, as you mentioned, Connie, it gets projected. That's what happens with shadow. And that's where we first meet those parts of ourselves, is in projection. But the invitation is to meet that part, as your book says, as the title says, and invite it in and develop a conscious relationship with it. And in a certain sense, integrate it, just like you integrated the capacity for a relationship. And of course, we can never entirely integrate the shadow. It's not like, oh, I'm done. I've integrated my shadow. But the point is that the shadow is aspects of us that we've split off, we've buried, we didn't want to know about. We want to say, that's not me. Jung said the shadow is everything that I don't wish to be, I think is the exact wording. the shadow is everything I don't wish to be. We certainly don't want to be thought of that way by other people. But if we can turn toward those parts of ourselves, it's like in your early life, you didn't value relationships maybe. And so it was very much a shadow characteristic. But when you turn toward it, you're like, wow, look, there's so much life here. There's so much energy. And it's a little uncomfortable to think of myself being that way, but maybe I could just try that on. And then it doesn't seem so scary anymore. And then maybe we can access some of the energy that's been kind of stored away in those energy, in those parts of ourselves that we just didn't let ourselves know about.
Right. And that's the gift.
Yeah, recovering that energy that's locked up there. I think also I would suggest to people if you're struggling with this in a relationship, to see if you can share this framework with your partner, whether through reading or class or podcast, because some of what happened for me was that Neil became able to understand what was going on, why I was the distancer and he was the pursuer, and what were the shadow characters in there and what was going on, and that it wasn't personal. Right? It wasn't against him, even though it felt initially to him like it was, and why we would keep having the same fights.
Mm-hmm.
And as we started to really explore this deeply, we really came to know each other in a way that I think many couples don't, because most, or I shouldn't say most, but some couples live in a kind of role-based persona relationship and don't really explore the psyche or the unconscious of one another. And so when we got married in 5 different traditions, 4 different spiritual traditions, and the shadow. And we made a vow to honor and respect each other's shadow characters. And we called that a shadow marriage. It took us 5 years to get there. It wasn't a quick and dirty process, but it was a kind of vow to inner work, take the journey together, to really honor each other's struggles and its issues and inner obstacles, timing, choices, and to really try to understand why all that was unfolding that way. So it's been a very beautiful, I feel that our relationship has been a spiritual practice because we made that vow.
Mm-hmm.
But you can only do that together. It's very hard for one person in a relationship to do that. I've seen it happen with just one person in the partnership, but it's more challenging.
Yeah, another thing that Jim will say sometimes is, you want to know about your shadow, ask your spouse.
Yeah, right.
I was talking to my husband about, someone in my family that I complain about a lot, just one of those things. It's like, oh my God, can you believe what she did? And I said, I wonder what she says about me. He goes, you want to know? Because I can tell you what she says about you.
Ah.
It's like, yeah.
So was there a mirror there in what you were both saying?
Well, he just meant, I know where you are acting in a shadowy way. Yes, she's acting in a shadowy way. Absolutely. But I know where you act in a shadowy way too. And of course, I'm sure he has good insight about that.
Uh-huh. Right.
I just want to add, highlight your book, Romancing the Shadow, in this context, because it is so specific and so detailed. And I don't know of any couple or maybe friendship, neighbors, anything in human relationships where we don't struggle with this stuff, sex and power and idealism and judgment, and the list goes on, and money. Oh, let's not leave that out. So these are books that I just think ought to be on everybody's bookshelf. And you can dip in and dip out. It's not as if you have to say, I'm gonna gobble up the whole 300 pages, every night until I'm done.
It's not that long. Is it? No. Oh my God, it is.
It is.
Wow.
I decided to do a page count. I was just curious. I thought, how many pages does it take to get through all these topics? And the answer is 300. But go in it a bit at a time. It's like having a figurine on your nightstand or kitchen table or windowsill. Let your awareness grow gradually, and it can. And these are books that are tools to yourself, to your own authenticity and awareness and greater intimacy and understanding with people. We're all hungry for that. And here's something you can put your hands on and implement.
And also for understanding the collective and what's going on now in our country and in the world, right?
As you said, Connie, I think it is just what we're wired to do.
Yeah.
And I think we all do it. And I think, you're right that it is a very, I think it is just what politicians do, right? Is find someone to kind of demonize. And, we have to be careful as citizens that we are thoughtful about what we take on board. Erich Neumann wrote this very important book called Depth Psychology and a New Ethic. And Erich Neumann was a colleague of Jung's, and he was also Jewish, and he and his family immigrated to Israel after World War II. He lived through the Holocaust, and, so he wrote Depth Psychology and a New Ethic afterwards. And basically what he says in it, this is like the one sentence summary of the book is, look, human societies have always, to a certain extent, utilized shadow projection as a way of kind of managing in-group, out-group. And it's been the source of a lot of suffering. But we are now capable of inflicting such destruction on each other that we have got to stop doing that. So Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, this very important book, it's small, but it really calls for us to do exactly what you've been inviting us to do today, which is to take responsibility for our shadow.
I think these times call us to really work harder to see shadow, out there and in here. The old alchemical mantra from the alchemists used to be, as above, so below.
Yeah.
We see in our country, in the macro, what is going on in the micro. And to take that really seriously.
And Connie, what I'm so appreciative is that your books have given us another tool to help with that discernment. And so we are so grateful for you coming back on the podcast today. And we will have links to your books in the show notes. So everyone should run out and buy the books.
Thank you both so much. I love talking to you.
Thank you for all your work over the years.
You too. Wish you both really well.
Thanks for listening. To submit a dream, suggest an episode topic, or join our mailing list, visit our website, thisjungianlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars and a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to click the notification bell to be alerted whenever we upload videos. And keep up with all things TJL by following us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok.